worry about myself and laugh at myself at one and the same time. So I've been laughing at myself ever since. The point of this is, don't take yourself too seriously. Try just laughing at some of your sillier worries, and see if you can't laugh them out of existence. I have always tried to keep my line of supplies open by Autry, the world's most famous and beloved singing cowboy. I figure that most worries are about family troubles and money. I was fortunate in marrying a small-town Oklahoma girl who had the same background I had and enjoyed the same things. We both try to follow the golden rule, so we have kept our family troubles to a minimum. I have kept my financial worries to a minimum also by doing two things. First, I have always followed a rule of absolute 100% integrity in everything. When I borrowed money, I paid back every penny. Few things cause more worry than dishonesty. Second, when I started a new venture, I always kept an ace in the hole. Military experts say that the first principle of fighting a battle is to keep your line of supplies open. I figure that that principle applies to personal battles almost as much as to military battles. For example, as a lad down in Texas and Oklahoma, I saw some real poverty when the country was devastated by droughts. We had mighty hard scratching at times to make a living. We were so poor that my father used to drive across the country in a covered wagon with a string of horses and swap horses to make a living. I wanted something more reliable than that. So I got a job working for a railway station agent and learned telegraphy in my spare time. Later, I got a job working as relief operator for the Frisco Railway. I was sent here, there, and yonder to relieve other station agents who were ill or on vacation or had more work than they could do. That job paid $150 per month. Later, when I started out to better myself, I always figured that that railroad job meant economic safety. So I always kept the road open back to that job. It was my line of supplies, and I never cut myself off from it until I was firmly established in a new and better position. For example, back in 1928, when I was working as a relief operator for the Frisco Railway in Chelsea, Oklahoma, a stranger drifted in one evening to send a telegram. He heard me playing the guitar and singing cowboy songs and told me I was good, told me that I ought to go to New York and get a job on the stage or radio. Naturally, I was flattered. And when I saw the name he signed to his telegram, I was almost breathless. Will Rogers. Instead of rushing off to New York at once, I thought the matter over carefully for 9 months. I finally came to the conclusion that I had nothing to lose and everything to gain by going to New York and giving the old town a whirl. I had a railroad pass. I could travel free. I could sleep sitting up in my seat, and I could carry some sandwiches and fruit for my meals. So I went. When I reached New York, I slept in a furnished room for $5 a week, ate at the automat, and tramped the streets for 10 weeks and got nowhere. I would have been worried sick if I hadn't had a job to go back to. I had already worked for the railway 5 years. That meant I had seniority rights. But in order to protect those rights, I couldn't lay off longer than 90 days. By this time, I had already been in New York 70 days, so I rushed back to Oklahoma on my pass and began working again to protect my line of supply. I worked for a few months, saved money, and returned to New York for another try. This time I got a break. One day, while waiting for an interview in a recording studio office, I played my guitar and sang a song to the girl receptionist. Janine, I dream of lilac time. While I was singing that song, the man who wrote it, Nat Shieldkraut, drifted into the office. Naturally, he was pleased to hear anyone singing his song. So he gave me a note of introduction and sent me down to the Victor Recording Company. I made a record. I was no good, too stiff and self-conscious. So I took the advice of the Victor recording man. I went back to Tulsa, worked for the railway by day, and at night I sang cowboy songs on a sustaining radio program. I liked that arrangement. It meant that I was keeping my line of supplies open, so I had no worries. I sang for 9 months on radio station KVOO in Tulsa. During that time, Jimmy Long and I wrote a song entitled That Silver-Haired Daddy of Mine. It caught on. Arthur Satherley, head of the American Recording Company, asked me to make a recording. It clicked. I made a number of other recordings for $50 each, and finally got a job singing cowboy songs over radio station well in Chicago. Salary: $40 a week. After singing there 4 years, my salary was raised to $90 a week, and I picked up another $300 doing personal appearances every night in theaters. Then in 1934, I got a break that opened up enormous possibilities. The League of Decency was formed to clean up the movies. So Hollywood producers decided to put on cowboy pictures. But they wanted a new kind of cowboy, one who could sing. The man who owned the American Recording Company was also part owner of Republic Pictures. "If you want a singing cowboy," he said to his associates, "I have got one making records for us." That is how I broke into the movies. I started making singing cowboy pictures for $100 a week. I had serious doubts about whether I would succeed in pictures, but I didn't worry. I knew I could always go back to my old job. My success in pictures exceeded my wildest expectations. I now get a salary of $100,000 a year plus 1/2 of all the profits on my pictures. However, I realize that this arrangement won't go on forever. But I am not worried. I know that no matter what happens, even if I lose every dollar I have, I can always go back to Oklahoma and get a job working for the Frisco Railway. I have protected my line of supplies. I heard a voice in India by E. Stanley Jones, one of America's most dynamic speakers and the most famous missionary of his generation. I have devoted 40 years of my life to missionary work in India. At first, I found it difficult to endure the terrible heat plus the nervous strain of the great task that stretched before me. At the end of 8 years, I was suffering so severely from brain fatigue and nervous exhaustion that I collapsed, not once but several times. I was ordered to take a year's furlough in America. On the boat returning to America, I collapsed again while speaking at a Sunday morning service on the ship, and the ship's doctor put me to bed for the remainder of the trip. After a year's rest in America, I started back to India, but stopped on the way to hold evangelistic meetings among the university students in Manila. In the midst of the strain of these meetings, I collapsed several times. Physicians warned me that if I returned to India, I would die. In spite of their warnings, I continued on to India, but I went with a deepening cloud upon me. When I arrived in Bombay, I was so broken that I went straight to the hills and rested for several months. Then I returned to the plains to continue my work. It was no use. I collapsed and was forced to return to the hills for another long rest. Again I descended to the plains, and again I was shocked and crushed to discover that I couldn't take it. I was exhausted mentally, nervously, and physically. I was completely at the end of my resources. I feared that I would be a physical wreck for the balance of my life. If I didn't get help from somewhere, I realized that I would have to give up my missionary career, go back to America, and work on a farm to try to regain my health. It was one of my darkest hours. At that time I was holding a series of meetings in Lucknow. While praying one night, an event happened that completely transformed my life. While in prayer and I was not particularly thinking about myself at the time, a voice seemed to say, "Are you yourself ready for this work to which I have called you?" I replied, "No, Lord, I am done for. I have reached the end of my resources." The voice replied, "If you will turn that over to me and not worry about it, I will take care of it." I quickly answered, "Lord, I close the bargain right here." A great peace settled into my heart and pervaded my whole being. I knew it was done. Life, abundant life, had taken possession of me. I was so lifted up that I scarcely touched the road as I quietly walked home that night. Every inch was holy ground. 4 days after that I hardly knew I had a body. I went through the days, working all day and far into the night, and came down to bedtime wondering why in the world I should ever go to bed at all, for there was not the slightest trace of tiredness of any kind. I seemed possessed by life and peace and rest by Christ Himself. The question came as to whether I should tell this. I shrank from it, but I felt I should and did. After that it was sink or swim before everybody. More than a score of the most strenuous years of my life have gone by since then, but the old trouble has never returned. I have never had such health. But it was more than a physical touch. I seemed to have tapped new life for body, mind, and spirit. After that experience, life for me functioned on a permanently higher level. And I had done nothing but take it. During the many years that have gone by since then, I have traveled all over the world, frequently lecturing 3 times a day, and have found time and strength to write The Christ of the Indian Road and 11 other books. Yet in the midst of all this, I have never missed, or even been late to, an appointment. The worries that once beset me have long since vanished, and now, in my 63rd year, I am overflowing with abounding vitality and the joy of serving and living for others. I suppose that the physical and mental transformation that I have experienced could be picked to pieces psychologically and explained. It does not matter. Life is bigger than processes and overflows and dwarfs them. This one thing I know. My life was completely transformed and uplifted that night in Lucknow, 31 years ago, when at the depth of my weakness and depression, a voice said to me, "If you will turn that over to me and not worry about it, I will take care of it," and I replied, "Lord, I close the bargain right here." When the sheriff came in my front door by Homer Croy, novelist, 150 Pinehurst Avenue, New York, New York. The bitterest moment of my life occurred one day in 1933 when the sheriff came in the front door and I went out the back. I had lost my home at 10 Standish Road, Forest Hills, Long Island, where my children were born and where I and my family had lived for 18 years. I had never dreamed that this could happen to me. 12 years before, I thought I was sitting on top of the